I have to say this, Mike. This is great, Michael, because I love that kind of stuff. The red flags that when we believed the text in the way that we believed them, was right there telling us stuff, and we were buying the narrative. It's so funny. I mean, you could literally find, and they went and bought a lottery ticket down at the local synagogue. And you know what I mean? These guys would still be like, yeah, this was first century Palestine. But what I love is about what you're saying, and it's very humorous now looking back. It's like, they were cooking in pots, things like that is like you can laugh at. What I love about that is you've heard mythicists, and I'm not saying that there wasn't a historical Jesus. It's a big thing. MythVision deals with this question a lot. And it's not just did this guy exist. This whole mythicism also incorporates ideas of places, people, not just Jesus. And like, did these places really exist? Was there really this Nazareth town, for example? This is according to a lot of scholars that I've been talking to lately, they're like, the place didn't really exist. It was this backwater small little village with a few huts. It wasn't even a city.
Well, the reason why they say it doesn't exist is because there's lists of towns that were conquered or reconquered by the Romans, and it's not mentioned in there. So the conclusion is it obviously didn't exist then if it wasn't mentioned in this list. And I don't think that's an accurate way to figure out whether it existed or not, because it was so small, it probably would not have been listed. So I don't know what the archaeological data is. I mean, they've been there, they've been digging, and I think it was probably around at that time. I think it actually did exist, but you're off. Derek?
Yeah.
Sound? Oh, there you go.
I'm sorry. There's a guy who made an argument for Nazareth not existing, and according to a lot of the guys that I bump into, they're like, Bart Ehrman hasn't dealt with this. Now, mind you, Bart Ehrman's been back and forth with Dr. Price at that debate, and the mythicist.
I'll let you know next time he calls me.
Huh?
I'll let you know next time he calls me.
Right?
Yeah, right.
But yeah, they said that he didn't touch the argument, and I don't even know the argument myself, but I'm interested to hearing some of these things you're talking about and wondering if that has any impact on the New Testament and dating. Scholars use this to date books such as like Titus. They say is much later, not first century, possibly late second century. And obviously you're dealing with concrete things, but what was the Abraham from Ur of Chaldees? What made that date later? Do you remember that argument?
The Chaldeans didn't exist back in the Bronze Age. I mean, they just
right.
That's an anachronistic statement for a Bronze Age. When Abraham supposedly existed.
But the Bible says.
Yeah.
I'm being dumb.
Oh, gosh, guys, it's a revelation. I mean, look at when horses were introduced into the area. And when it talks about a horse, it had to be later. Genesis talks about that. And what's that verse in Genesis 36 where it says, at this time there had been no king in Israel? Really? You're writing back then in the time of the first patriarchs and saying there was no king in Israel, which means that there were kings in Israel when you wrote it. Oh, right. Come on, guys.
How do you know that there were no kings exactly?
Right.
The language gives it away in a lot of the cases. So, so the Bible, so now we have the astrological aspects coming out of Babylon. The Greek, this explains why there was Greek aspects of astrology in the book. There's also things of personal astrology that was in there. For David was very much a Sagittarius. Joseph was the epitome of generosity when he was in Taurus. So it was the beginning of the personal astrology era, which really picked up around 400 BC is when they started injecting the planets into it. But right now, we're just looking at constellations born in certain constellations without the planets. So this is an earlier version of astrology. So we got this aspect in it, the Greek aspect in it. So this is all coming together, and there's evidence that even what they call the Book of J was, I don't consider it to be full. I consider it to be redacted. The Book of J was written in segments. So there, I still have my basic part that was written. It was added to. Then Finkelstein seems to believe that the court of David came from King Omri. Why, I don't know, but that's he draws comparison between. He doesn't deal with the mythological aspects of David that I do, all the stuff. He has no idea how to deal with David and Goliath. He does some comparison on it. The whole Bathsheba thing, he's like, why would they even put such a negative story in there? He doesn't even imagine, why it's even there, or but the other stuff that takes place seems to happen in the age of Omri. And
it's because God wrote it. God had to write it for the negative stuff to be included. That's right. Otherwise, if it was just humans, they never would have put this negative stuff about their own people in the book.
Thank you.
So Solomon comes in.
You're welcome, Derek.
So let's go back. Let's see what we got. Oh, that right there. That is Nabonidus right there. That's him. And of course, he favors the moon god Sin. And there we have the 3 symbols for our 4 symbol sun. And then here we have Venus with 7 points instead of 8. So,
okay, wait a minute. Now, the moon god Sin, is that the god for whom Mount Sinai or Mount Sinai was named?
I think so.
Is there a connection there?
That is what I claim in my book, that is where it is. And I have that located in the constellation of Cetus, that is like the south polar star for Mount Sinai.
Dude, I don't want to, look, I know I'm going to have to let this go, but I got to ask you one thing. If that is so, what are the implications of Israel, according to their lore, receiving the law from the mountain of the moon god, from Mount Sinai? What does that say about the law of Moses?
Well, it does talk a lot about sin. So
no, sin is not sin. Right. Don't connect the sin with sin. All right.
Okay, this is the moon god.
Are you telling me that the etymology that I'm using is faulty? Like what was his name? Jordan Maxwell does this argument. I don't know if you guys have heard it, ladies and gentlemen. The enemy of Horus, Osiris, and these gods was Set. And this is why we have sunrise and sunset. The enemy of the sun is Set. This is where our etymology of Set, sunset, comes from. And I
believe it. Okay.
Yeah, right? Like, that's the etymological approach he takes. And I'm like, I don't know, man.
Etymodulomania, right? Is that what they talk about parallelomania? That's etymodulomania. I don't know. I know that's not a word, but I've heard scholars use that term with parallels.
Michael, I got a question, man. Our audience hasn't read your book probably, and they need to. And I suspect you talk about this stuff in your book. But you mentioned just recently with David and Goliath, okay? That's a famous story. Everyone loves that story. Freaking atheists love that story. They love picking at it. But regardless, everybody knows it. Everybody knows about it. What do you say differently about that story that Finkelstein and these other people don't? If you don't mind touching on that for a second, that'd be awesome. I'd like to hear what you say about it, because I know it's a celestial slant, I suspect.
Yeah, it is. One of the things that it is common is there are other stories that are similar to it. Egypt has one, Sinu, instead of, I think he used a bow and arrow or whatever. May have been where it was from. The Philistines, I think, have another story similar to it. But no, this is the constellation of Capricorn. Goliath, I think, was in the head of the goat, and David was from the tail part, and they came down and met in battle in a field. And there's a number of stars that would indicated armor and the field in Capricorn. And the fact
I think the field was called Ephes Damim. It's just coming back to me. It's weird how these little things. It's something like a field of blood. It's a weird name, very elaborate there.
One of the other things that I noticed is that the original Bible, the points are all wrong. The solstice and the equinoxes in the Bible date from that Nautum Sin time, from the Bronze Age, which is probably what they would have dug up in Nabonidus, because the Assyrians had already changed it. They had already changed it from Taurus to Aries, made it the first constellation, and moved it on. And now they're digging this stuff up in Babylon that contradicts that, and they probably went back to this older stuff. So they're doing this, and now it's Solomon had this huge kingdom. Let's get into that, because we're starting to drift toward the Newer Testament.
Okay.
Let's go right here. I like this one. Mac 15:33. This is the justification that the Jews gave for taking land. And they went under John Hyrcanus I, they went and conquered other people. And they said, no, we're not taking their land. We're just simply taking back property that we inherited from our ancestors, land that had been justly taken away from us by our enemies at one time or another. I mean, it's classic Sudetenland type of terminology, but yeah, they used it to say their own land. So the creation of this whole kingdom of Solomon would have justified them taking all this land. And that's what they wanted to do. They wanted to control the land from Egypt to Persia. They wanted to get rid of the Greeks. They wanted the Romans to help them out. So they sent emissaries to Rome. They actually bribed the Roman senator supposedly with a half ton of gold. And they signed a treaty with Rome, that they would, if Rome got attacked, Judah would help them against their enemies.
Sure.
And if Judah got attacked, Rome would help them. Now, this got translated from the Aramaic to Greek to Latin. So the Romans didn't quite see it. They didn't read it in the same light that the Jews read it in. It was more benign for the Romans, and they didn't really have to do much of anything. So, but the treaty was there. I think they wrote it in bronze or gold tablet or something, and and presented it. So it was there. They had a very close relationship, but not a too close relationship. But they trying to get this relationship with Rome. Also, what they wanted to do was they wanted to have all the Jews who lived in the Roman Empire. They wanted to have control over them too, and Rome was kind of like backing off on that. So the big stink came about in 175 BC. Guy named Jason decides he wants to wrestle naked with other men, right? So he builds gets permission to build a gymnasium in Jerusalem. You walk into a gymnasium, there's two statues are there. One is Hercules and one is Hermes. Hermes represents the mind. So the gymnasium was not just a place where nude men would wrestle. it was also a place where they would learn. They would learn Greek philosophy, they would learn language, they would learn grammar, they would learn, you know, all the mathematics skills, they would learn rhetoric, they would read the Greek plays, they would read Aristophanes making fun of the Pythagoreans and all that other good stuff. And they would also wrestle naked. They would also get ready for the Olympian Games. Now, there was a problem there when the Jews got naked. One of these things was not like the other, all right? So they are circumcised.
Whoa, okay.
And, oh, yeah, and they're exposed. In the Greek culture, that's the no-no. That is, they make fun of you, they point, they laugh, they ridicule. It's considered vulgar. You had to have it covered. So what the Jews would do is something called a reverse circumcision operation, so they could go into the gymnasium. And it was advertised as being painless, and to me that means they must have had trade with Afghanistan, because I can't understand how this would be painless. What they would do is they would take a little sharp object and they would cut along the shaft, the skin of the shaft, and peel it back up over the head and kind of tie it off and then let it heal underneath. So you would have this natural shroud over the top and you wouldn't see anything that was going on. There's also references to this in Maccabees, but these were Jews who hated being Jews, is what they said. So there were Jews that really weren't big on the circumcision. They were going in. The nice thing under Julius Caesar, if you had graduated from the gymnasium, you were offered, you could get a position, an administration position in the Roman Empire. You leave Jerusalem, go somewhere else, and get a nice little cushy job somewhere. So there was an incentive for people, for Jews, to go to these gymnasiums and become like their Greeks. And this was a very dividing spot among the Jews. So at some point in time, we end up with the Jews having sectarian violence. I think the Medes came back in and did some invasion. The Jews were divided into different groups. Some like the Greeks, some like the Persians. It was kind of odd. It's sort of like the United States was, where some like the English, some like the French, and we were divided up. We had the Federalists who liked the English and the Jeffersonians who liked the French, and you know, that type of thing. But we have this lady here who came in, Salome. Salome ruled after her two husbands. The first husband, I think, was Alexander Janus. He was part of the Sadducees, and he had an outbreak with the Pharisees. He ended up crucifying 900 Pharisees. 900 Pharisees, his own people. He crucified them. And while they were supposedly hanging on the cross, he brought their families, their women and children there and cut their throats. So while they were on the cross, so they were dying on the cross, they could see their family being slaughtered. So that was some of the sectarian violence that the Jews had. Then he died, his brother took over, and his brother married his wife. Now, this caused problems. The Bible says, yes, you marry your brother's wife. That's fine. But also, as a high priest, you can't marry a woman who's not a virgin. So no matter what happened, it worked out pretty bad. So she ended up ruling pretty good for a while. Good, kind ruler. She was the ruler of the land. She was the queen, and she appointed her oldest son, John Hyrcanus II, to be the high priest. Problem started when she died, and he was going to take over as ruler. His brother didn't like that. His brother, Aristobulus II, notice all these nice Greek names, the Greeks that they hated. So They go to war, big war, battling
That's
back
an
and forth.
ugly looking
Aristobulus is getting the upper hand.
Okay.
So what happens is a couple things happen. Let's go back. Dead Sea Scrolls. I believe that Aristobulus II is the wicked priest in the Dead Sea Scrolls. It was during his reign that this unknown priest was killed by him. And this kind of sets up the whole Jesus narrative, the righteous teacher. He was, there was an argument over the calendar. Now, supposedly the righteous teacher had been everywhere, done everything. And they were arguing over when Passover should be. And the righteous teacher was probably using this first book of Enoch, which stated that the calendar was 364 days. He took the standard Babylonian 360-day solar calendar, and he added 4 days to it for the solstice, 2 for the equinox. So Aristobulus didn't like that, had him killed. And going to sidebar here on calendars. All right. Enoch, right? Lived how many years?
365, I believe it. Yeah.
Yes, 365. Bible says 365 years because that is the number of days in a year. The issue with this is the Jews didn't have a 365-day calendar. Where did that number come from? Right? They had the lunar calendar, which was 356 days, and then they had the 360-day calendar that they got from Babylon, and then they added the 364-day calendar, and then they used the 19-year lunar solar calendar that the Babylonians had, right?
Okay.
The Egyptians had this 365-day year, but it was actually 360 plus 5 days.
Right.
The gods were born. The gods had to be born outside of the calendar year, and Thoth made these 5 days outside of the calendar year for them. The 365-day calendar was not invented until 47 BC. Someone went up, hey, Julius Caesar, you know there's like 365 days in the year, right? He's like, really? We got to change the calendar. So he added 67 days to the calendar. And he wanted everything to start right around the winter solstice. The Romans loved the winter solstice. Egyptians loved summer solstice, and Mesopotamia, they were in love with the vernal equinox. But Rome had the Roman solstice, and that's when that 365-day calendar started. And even in Revelation, they're still using a 360-day calendar. So I'm trying to get where this 365, that had to have been a very late redaction. All right, now let me talk.
Okay. So let's see. Enoch is talked about very early in Genesis. We're talking about Genesis chapter 5, the generations of Adam. What do you think about that, Derek? A 365-day calendar in Genesis 5.
I mean, if I heard you correct, Michael, and he said Julius Caesar, dude, do you know how late that puts Genesis?
Yeah.
Bro, Genesis should be called Revelation.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah, right.
It was probably just a redaction. It probably wasn't a whole right of Genesis.
I'm just being funny.
I just changed the year on that. I tried to look for that script in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and that particular verse it doesn't seem to be there.
What happened? What?
They don't have a complete Genesis. They have partial Genesis. So not every verse of Genesis is in the scrolls.
Interesting.
So
I don't know what to make of that there, guys. I mean, could it be later? Could it be that these are... Now, does the Masoretic say the same thing as the Septuagint? And technically, I guess the Masoretic does look a lot into the Septuagint, because from what... And I could be mistaken. I mentioned this on my last show, like Tobias Singer, right? He's hardcore Jew. And he's like... like he likes to delve into some interesting things in a different way, theologically and linguistically, different than what we've been talking about with some of the actual archaeological evidence that kind of says, it's much later. Some of it's linguistic, some of it's archaeological. But he said something about, where David, or in one of the Psalms, it may not be David, where he says, they pierced my hands, my feet, in the Septuagint. It does not say that in the Masoretic. The Masoretic text says, like a lion. It has something to do with a lion, and it has nothing to do with them
They
piercing.
clawed him like a lion, right?
Yes. Nothing to do with
right,
piercing.
yeah.
Now he says, watch this, and he shows the Septuagint, and then he shows the Masoretic, and he says, look at these two texts. Now, look at these two texts. You know how he talks. He's got that like Jewish slant, and it's cool listening to him because he's like an apologist for Judaism. But I still love it because he's on fire to prove his point, and he shows one letter difference between the Masoretic and the Septuagint, showing whoever edited the Septuagint was probably Christian, and they purposely put their Christ into these texts of the Old Testament. So this was something he says, if you look at the Hebrew, it makes no sense that they pierced his hands and his feet. Read the story. It's talking about a lion circling them and this and this and that, and then all of a sudden they pierce his hands and his feet. Makes no sense, he said, but they, like a lion, clawed him. Makes sense. And I just wanted to throw that out there. Like, could these be thrown in there after the fact? Absolutely. Be cool to find something that said 364, Enoch lived 364, and then here's 365. That would be like, oh.
I know. I want to look for it, Derek. Now I'm excited about it.
I know you will, Luther.
Yeah, that's my
One of the things I do mention in my book was the famous one in Isaiah where they talk about the virgin being born and it being the young girl. And in the Septuagint now it's the virgin from the Hebrew young girl. My argument is that was deliberate because it had nothing to do with Jesus, but they knew this was an astrological statement about the prophecy concerning the constellation Virgo, and they changed it from young girl to virgin because they knew the astrology behind it, and it was a deliberate mistranslation.
Deliberate, though, yeah.
It had nothing to do with.
And hey, I mean, look, what if, and I don't know, I haven't researched it, what if Tovia Singer's wrong? What if the piercing of the hands and the feet has some celestial motif as well? But I kind of think he might be onto something because we've been talking about this, and the more you guys talk about it, the closer the Old Testament and Septuagint texts start to get to the first century, it makes me wonder if there's this succinct flow of ideas where out of this Septuagint Old Testament text, you have this natural evolution of what we see fully developed in Christianity, and they literally pocket it to the Septuagint in such a way that it fits. And we can't forget the celestial slant. That's what I think isn't discussed enough, which is why we need guys like you and more guys like you, Michael, that can come on and go, look, I get it. There's the politics, got it. There's the theology. But are you guys even looking up? You're missing on earth as it is in heaven. You're missing this celestial thing. And I think it's because it bogs people down. It's so much information. They don't know the names of the zodiac signs. They don't know the celestial systems. They don't understand it. And we're trying to make it dumbed down, but I'm still trying to learn. You guys have said a few. I'm like, huh?
Well, one of the things you got to watch is because they use a lot of old sources and when were things written, and like one of the things you see that's very popular, and I fell into that trap too, and you see it on the zeitgeist thing that's really popular, is that you had all these gods, Mithra and Horus, they were all born on December 25th, right? No, there is no, Egypt didn't have a December 25th, all right? Horus was the second god born, and that would have been before the, right before the summer solstice. That's when Horus was born. Now, maybe Horus Harpocrates the child, but what they were doing in the later ADs was, when we started out with all the sun gods being consolidated, Rome was consolidating all these gods, and they were all being born at the winter solstice. So Rome was making these dates up. These are late AD dates. So the idea that Jesus was born December 25th, being borrowed from some ancient Egyptian script from 2000 BC or Mithra, this, that, and the other, it didn't happen. All right. So you need to stop believing people with professional wrestling names like Akira S and real biblical names like Israel Finkelstein or Paige Turner. Okay.
So Luther, I have to ask Luther this here. Do you see any political Roman angle here now that he's mentioning that can be explored in light of the politic thing that you've been researching? Because he's mentioning the winter equinox is a Roman thing. So now we can
Right.
it's deeper and start going, what else are we finding in the text of the New Testament? And how can we look at it through the angle of what the Romans would reinvent and place in there? You know what I mean?
I think not just the New Testament, but even the Old Testament. Look at the Genesis story that we're agreeing seems to have been written later than traditional scholarship would ascribe. You look at the first 7 days of creation. They seem to start, at least by one scheme, as I calculated, from the winter solstice, from the very occasion that the Romans made note of. If you look at Capricorn and you count the 7 signs up to Cancer, Leo being just beyond, and line them up with the 7 days of creation, they seem to line up perfectly. So yeah, even Genesis is influenced in this general push to make syncretism easier, to make it accessible. Let's get all the gods together. Let's do it in a way where across the empire, people can grab hold of this thing, which Rome needed to do and did. So yeah, that makes perfect sense. That in order for this to go forward in the empire, they've got to make it accessible to most of the people. It's a daunting task, but they did a good job in doing it.
Okay, let's continue further with this idea. What happened? So let's go back. Aristobulus, right?
Okay, wait a minute. Which one? The first, the one that got. Okay, we didn't say anything about the first, the one that got together the Hebrew canon. I was waiting for you to say something about him.
No. Something I wanted to say was like in Chronicles. There's a tell there in Chronicles where David has the census, right? He's commanded to do a census. In Kings, he's commanded to do that census by God. In Chronicles, it is Satan who commands him to do that same sentence.
Right.
Census. So the influence of Satan came from the Zoroastrian religion. So that is a post-Persian influence that they had. So you can see the differences in the text because the Persians were really big into demons and archangels and guardian angels, which they called watchers. Meteors were witches, and comets were known as mouse witches. They had all these different names and stuff for them. Planets were bad because they moved. The stars were good. That was God's creation. They were steady. They were in place. They were always there. But the planets that zipped around, no, that goes against God's creation. And when they were in retrograde, it was really bad. Right? Those were really bad. Okay. That's for the.
You've got to answer me something, Michael. This is important because let's go ahead and set the record for those who want to know what they are. If you can, what are the Watchers? And I want to follow that up with, I've had people, I'm going to name them, Jim Fishburne, people like that. They're online, and they're like, you don't understand the Bible if you don't understand the Watchers. Now, I don't know if it's something that we are prone to do when we look at stuff and we get lost in theology and certain studies and stuff. And you already know, you can YouTube the Watchers and get lost. What are the Watchers from a critical skeptical?
according to the Persians, the Watchers are simply guardian angels. That's it. Nothing special. No aliens from, outer space or anything who, came down here. Nothing like that.
What about the
I
theory?
wanted to mention.
Oh, I was going to say,
Huh?
what about them being the Nephilim, or there's a connection to them being tied in, and these fallen angels are the Watchers, and none of that?
I think that would have been pre-Zoroastrian. I mean, there may have been something in there that was different, but later on, the Watchers simply became guardian angels. It may not have been the same throughout history. They may have evolved. Oh, something interesting about cuneiform texts. The first cuneiform texts were receipts, work compensation receipts. They're just so-and-so was paid. There was records of workers being paid, right? And they put them in boxes. And it was 1,000 years before they learned to start writing in lines. So if cuneiform was invented by aliens, they were really stupid aliens. They were like morons from space. So just thought I'd throw that out there. All you 12th Planet fans, okay?
Oh my gosh.
So anyway, we have Aristobulus II, bad guy. Story is that the 200 wealthy Jews went up to Pompey. Pompey had just conquered Turkey, and he got all the land ceded to him from the Turkish king. So he was sitting up there in Damascus, just enjoying himself, having a good time. And these Jews come up and they said, we have problems with Aristobulus and Hyrcanus. These guys are fighting. Could you please help us out? So he says, guys, come up, talk to me, because you don't want me to come down there. So he looks at him and he decides that Hyrcanus is going to be the high priest because he's kind of a weenie. And Aristobulus is very strong. He doesn't want to deal with him at all. So Hyrcanus goes back. He's the high priest. And Aristobulus doesn't like the decision. So he goes off to another city, he fortifies it, builds himself an army, thinks Pompey is going to respect him. It doesn't happen. Pompey goes and battles him and drags him to the gates of Jerusalem. So that is one of the things that is mentioned in the Dead Sea Scrolls, is that he was arrested and tortured by Kittim. Kittim meaning Rome.
Rome, right.
So any body you want to have to be these unknown characters had to have fallen after Pompey, after Rome got involved. So, and if you look at the carbon 14 dating, the AD period is out. So you have this small window of what high priest was arrested by Rome. And this is basically the only one you're going to find. I mean, as far as fitting that bill. So, yeah, he was arrested. He sends him back to Rome. It doesn't even put him in jail. He goes back to Rome and he fights again with Alexander, who was Aristobulus' brother. And then Aristobulus II, he comes back, gets himself an army, fights against Pompey again. This time he sends him back in prison, and then he imprisons him in Rome, fights his son a second time, and then Pompey's enemies let Aristobulus out of prison so he could go raise an army and fight him again, but he ends up getting assassinated before he gets there. So very intriguing, very much going on. So he's in there, and a lot of things are going on at this time. Probably the most important thing, and let me, who do we got here? Where are we at on the share? Aristobulus. Got a little bit of Pompey action.
Okay.
He looks so young there. Philo of Alexandria.
Uncle Philo.
Uncle Philo. His whole family was rich. They were in import-export business. His family was oversaw the all the shipping in Alexandria. He was appointed to that position. His brother, I should say, was appointed to that position by one of the Caesars. I think maybe Julius Caesar, to that position. So they had money, power, influence. And Philo was very well educated, and he wrote quite a bit, and it was based a lot on the Greek Gnosticism that they had at the time. And it's kind of interesting. He wrote about what was known the Logos, which appears in the book of John, where he basically says the Logos is known as the Word of God. The Spirit is the breath of God. These are concepts that he wrote about. Then he also said that God would send his Son down to teach mankind, to be a teacher. This is similar to what the righteous teacher was, who was a teacher of mankind. He had already set this model up. And he says, yes, he's going to send his Son down. The Son of God is going to come down to heaven and teach us. Now, this Christ figure had to go through a period of reincarnation. There was something called the Octodad, or Octoad, Ogdaod, or something like that.
Means a set of 8.
There was a set of 8 levels that they had to reincarnate up. And at that 8th level, that top level, you would become Christ. You would become one with Christ. And so it took a long time to get there. This was part of the original Christianity. You can see this reflected in the gospel, where at one point they said, oh, who are you? Are you Elijah? It's like that was probably who they thought he originally was, and then ascended up to this Christ position to be the Son of God. So Philo was setting this whole thing up. Also in Alexandria, there was the virgin would give birth to one of the aeon. And the aeon was what was abstract things that belonged to God. Some was the power of God, the wisdom of God, and the word of God. Okay. And he was born on January 5th, I believe, was the date that they selected for his birth. So again, we're tying it in with the winter solstice period that he was being born. So Philo had set up that and the righteous teacher. Between the two of them, they're setting up the model for Jesus. Now, Jesus, was he historical? Was he not historical? That's the big question. And I am not going to answer that for you because I can't. Neither can anybody else. But it seems like the Bible is set up, the Catholic Church set up the Bible. They put Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, right? They put Matthew first, even though all the scholars say Mark was the oldest gospel because it's the shortest. But there are other ones who say, no, it was Matthew. There was an original Matthew that may have been written in Aramaic that was used by the Ebionites, doesn't have the virgin birth, doesn't have the resurrection, very similar to Mark. And it ended up getting destroyed. And then another Matthew was written, all right, a newer Matthew, and that's the one that's in there right now. And there are certain texts that look better written in Aramaic that may have been mistranslations. There was idioms that were used by the Jews in Aramaic that were not understood and fully and translated word for word into Greek.
Right.
There are other things. The one I like is, I think Ian Wilson mentions this in his book, Jesus, the Evidence. That phrase of the camel going through the eye of the needle, right? Easier for a camel to go through an eye of a needle than it is for a rich man to go into heaven. So what they come up with is all these different explanations of what the camel going through the eye of the needle actually means. Oh yeah, this is nighttime. Gates are closed. He had to go down on his knees and crawl underneath and this, that, and the other. I go, nah, I doubt that. They probably just wait till daytime. They had to go through all that. You know, it doesn't make any sense. And what he says with the word camel and the word rope are nearly identical. There's like just a little tittle difference between the two. And he suggests that this was originally Aramaic, and the word was a rope going through the eye of a needle, which makes sense. You know, you try to get a rope through the eye of a needle, you know. And he said that's kind of evidence that the Aramaic was probably the original language, and this was a mistranslation into the Greek because he missed the word.
All right, I'm going to keep it real with you, though. Don't you agree, though, that maybe, I wouldn't say that the whole thing was Aramaic, but that maybe there were common phrases in that time, that maybe this is a phrase that may have been an Aramaic one that they were trying to put in. And obviously the author, my opinion, maybe being Greek, mistakenly places this statement here and has a mistake of trying to utilize something Jewish or possibly Aramaic in nature over into a Greek manuscript. And this is where a mistake like this would happen. I guess it's speculation, because technically we don't have originals to say, well, the original actually says this. Whereas I think that maybe it's a common Aramaic phrase that, hey, you can't fit the rope through the eye of a needle. You know, that sounds almost like something we would say commonly in American language. And then if it goes down into someone who speaks Spanish in Spain, they might slip up and phrase it into something else. I suspect. I don't know. What do you think?
Yeah, well, that's just one. There's a number of these that are better in Aramaic than they are in the Greek. And we're just saying the one book, Matthew, was originally this Aramaic book that was lost, that was used by the Ebionites.
Okay.
So yeah, and they had a big discussion with another priest in their day over the virgin birth, and they denied that there was a virgin birth. So obviously their text did not have it. They also point to when Jesus was baptized in their text, and they say in the original Matthew, the voice came down from heaven saying, "This is my son in whom I'm proud." And then the phrase goes, "This day I have begotten thee." And I think that came from the Old Testament too. And
yes, it came from the Psalms.
Yeah,
Psalm 2,
was
I believe.
Supposedly been in the original Bible text. And when the church did the whole virgin birth thing, they had to go through and destroy all the texts that had that in it. So in order to keep their virgin birth narrative, and that's how all these texts ended up getting destroyed.
Right. They can't have their everlasting divine Trinitarian understanding with that. No, and Michael, I agree that it's possible. Me and Luther talked about Matthew before, and that's actually what I was saying. I wasn't suggesting Mark, Luke. Of course, Luke goes way beyond anything that would be Aramaic and anything that would be truly Hebrew.
Right.
But when you look at Matthew, yeah, I think that it's the most Hebrew. However, it's still speculation. I mean, it's unless we found a proto version of Matthew, in my opinion, it's like, what if this was someone who's trying to write to a Jewish audience using phrases that may have been Aramaic and common and incorporated into Greek? Now, it could be just as easily said, hey, there was a guy who translated it from Aramaic into Greek, and these are the mistakes. Or it could be that someone who was trying to convert a Aramaic language or Aramaic phrases, putting them into a book for Hebrew people, made these mistakes into the Greek. Either way.
And Derek, we looked at this before in relation to Matthew, reasoning that if Matthew was originally in the Hebrew, then a lot of the anti-Jewish references would not be present, and yet they are. If we look at the Hebraic Matthew, which actually came forth in the 9th century by apologists who were eager to find a manuscript of Matthew that was in Hebrew, but it contains the same anti-Jewish material that the pro-Romans want to ascribe to it. Well, there it is, and it's written in Hebrew too. That doesn't make much sense. And this problem of taking a text that's in Greek and resolving it back into Hebrew or Aramaic in order to eliminate the problems in it is something that we find on both sides of the millennium. They did the same thing with the testimony of the 12 patriarchs. The testimony of Levi was supposedly originally written in Hebrew. Even though we have the Greek, we no longer have the Hebrew. Well, how do scholars know that? Well, they figure out that must be the case because there are too many problems in the Greek, and when you retranslate it into the Hebrew, they disappear. So, you know, again, it's not just the language it's written in, but the elements in it, do they make sense culturally? Do they make sense politically in order for it to be written in that language? So I think that's something we have to take into consideration.
It all depends on what the target audience is and what they're trying to do. And there are many Jews who loved Rome. I mean, that was their bread and butter. Rome put the high priest in power. He made him what he did. And there were Jews who hated the Jews who loved the Romans. I mean, they're all different sects who hated this. So if you want to say there were Jews who were very pro-Roman, who could have been writing pro-Roman stuff and some things that are anti-Jewish. Like we said before, from the gymnasium, how they hated circumcision and certain things and food rights that they tended to ignore. Which brings us up to 66 AD, when we had the Great Jewish War. Times are right is what we were told. Everything just kind of fell into place. What scholars don't mention is that there was a comet that year. Halley's Comet appeared. And that would have been seen as a sign. So it's like, okay, now they all go into this berserker mode. There's 3 people out there who claim to be the Messiah, right? They had 3 different sects following these 3 different guys, and they're all trying to battle against the Roman Empire, fight the Romans. However, when they can't find a Roman to fight, they're fighting against pro-Roman Jews or any rich Jew or anybody in power. They were killing them. So finally, these 3 groups who represent the 3 different messiahs, they get stuck in Jerusalem. They're in a siege in Jerusalem. And while they're there, waiting to get attacked, they go after the other one's food supply. So this other group, so the other sect would die of starvation, even though they have a common enemy in Rome. They're fighting among themselves, waiting for Rome to attack. Now, when Rome finally does attack, they get together and go after the Romans. But meanwhile, they're just fighting against each other. And it reminds me of a scene out of like Monty Python's Life of Brian, when you have the People's Group of Judea and the Judean People's Front, you know, they're both going to kidnap Pilate's wife and hold her for ransom. And they come together. I guess they're using like the aqueduct or sewage system, and they're back underneath there, and they're there, and they meet, and they're up there in the palace now, Pilate's palace, and the Roman guards are standing around them, and they're arguing amongst themselves. And then they start fighting and killing each other. And the Romans just kind of like sitting back, like scratching their heads, like, you know, they're not believing this. And that's what I'm seeing. What's happening in Jerusalem? It's like, my God, you know, you guys are killing each other when they're coming in because, yeah, you believe in a different Messiah. They believe this guy's the Messiah. No, this guy's the Messiah. And it's like, you know, what is happening here? So one of the guys.
Jeez.
Yeah. So let's go here.
This is funny.
There we said that was
that's Vespasian.
Titus, right?
That's his father, Vespasian.
Vespasian. And then Titus took over on the siege. His second in command was right here, Tiberius Julius Alexander, who was the nephew of Philo of Alexandria. His dad was imprisoned by Caligula, and Claudius got him out. They financed the war. He was their second in command. He was overlooking his investment as they took the siege of Jerusalem. So here we have a prominent Jew paying for the war against the Jews.
Right.
So if you want to look at you know, just because the New Testament has pro-Roman and anti-Jew stuff in it, it's hard to say that it was written not by Jews. I was reading the other day that even when Sargon was marching back around 2300 BC, he had merchants marching with him, and they were paying for his campaign. They're saying, go further, go further. And they wanted to establish merchants, dealers in these different cities that Sargon went into. So even back then, you had bankers or merchants paying for wars. So I just think it's interesting how that worked, you know, when everyone looks at all these different, you know, the who's in charge, who owns the money, who has the purse. There's always merchants, and the merchants who had it.
And talk about a conflict of interest. Tiberius Julius Alexander was procurator of Judea from 44 to 46 AD. And under him, 2 sons of Judas the Galilean were crucified. So you have this guy who was procurator of Judea, financing the war against Judea, at least the rebels, and then at Titus's side. Of course, he had renounced Judaism. But
yeah, and Galilee was a sore spot. They weren't very religious Jews there. They kind of ignored the dietary laws. They talked funny. They talked a little different than the proper speaking Jews. They would when they go to Jerusalem, they would make fun of them of how they talked, and we see that in the Bible. I think when they said to Peter, "Oh, you must be one of them because your voice or the sound or your
speech gives you away." Right.
Gives you away. Yes. Yeah. They knew they were different. That was the Galilean, and they were rebels. I mean, they some say Judas Iscariot was probably one of these Galilean assassins. There was 5 generations of family from Galilee who led insurrections against the Roman Empire, going all the way up to Bar Kokhba and then starting back in the BC period, including the tax revolt that's mentioned in Luke. And he coincides the 7 AD tax revolt with the birth of Jesus.
Right.
Right, which would have been in 7 AD. And then he talks about Jesus's ministry, which he says he was about 30, and technically he would have been about 23 if you looked at Luke from a historical perspective. But so yeah, was Jesus real? Was he not? Who knows? It's one of those things that he could have been a real teacher, and they kind of, you know, built this up around him.
That would be the only other explanation. I mean, is he doesn't fit. I mean, to me, he doesn't fit any sect. He purposely rises against the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Well, where does that place him other than possibly a fourth philosophy or somewhere else? And then if he does fit into some rebel type group, where does he actually appear that way? Well, the only thing I could think of is the crucifixion of the Romans crucifying him, which makes sense if he was a rebel leader. However, he looks like he doesn't look like a rebel leader, and he denies. There's too much mythology mixed in there. It's tough to say. Not saying he didn't exist, just saying that person in the Gospels didn't exist. So whatever really existed, there may be fragments in the Gospels, but how do you know that that's actually him? Could this, you know what I mean? Like,
and Derek, to piggyback on that, and Michael, I'm developing for my book a timeline of Roman conquest of Judea. It actually goes before that. It'll start around the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, coming on up past 70 AD. And it's kind of a Christianity timeline, but it's Christianity light because there's no Jesus in it. And it makes perfect sense without the Jesus figure. Everything fits together. You can have a timeline totally about Christianity without Christ. And it's interesting. So you say, is it necessary to have this figure of Jesus in order to make everything make sense? I mean, for example, you have Vitellius, who was the father of the Emperor Vitellius. He was the governor of Syria and Pontius Pilate's boss under, who was it? Not Augustus, the next one, Tiberius, under Tiberius. So if there's anybody who should have written about Jesus, and this guy had a ton of correspondence, it would be him. He's a Roman official. He didn't disappear into obscurity the way Pontius Pilate did. His son later became emperor. If there's anybody in history who should have written about Jesus, it would be Lucius Vitellius. Nothing. Why not? And you have instances like that all throughout
he wasn't that
the
important,
timeline.
Luther.
Oh, I'm sorry. That's right. Forgive me.
That's the Bart Ehrman.
Well,
that's the Bart Ehrman. That's the the historians will tell you. He wasn't that important. He became important, but he wasn't during that time. Therefore, there was no need to mention him. But they're definitely going to mention people like, Judas the Galilean, or Judah the Galilean, and other phenomenally well-spoken people. But none of these guys had myths around them. And I wonder why. Because if this Jesus guy really died and was really killed, just like Judah was really killed, and Judah did all these probably greater things in the eyes of a Jew than Jesus really did in terms of actually physically trying to get some stuff done for the nation of Israel, no myth surrounded Judah the Galilean the way Jesus. And if there was, it's been extinguished. So what the heck? There's too many, and it's all speculation, what I'm saying. But I also say the same of them. They're he wasn't that important. How do you know he wasn't that important? How do you know he existed? Well, because there's 100 years later, there's something that's
let me throw a wrench in here. Paul wrote before our current Gospels were written, right? Paul was writing, and one of the characters that Paul mentions and that everybody else seems to mention in their writings is James, the brother of Jesus. So if you're going to get rid of Jesus as a mythical character, you're going to have to get rid of the guy who was known as his brother too.
It's actually James, the brother of the Lord.
Right.
And that is a very important
distinction. It is.
Because if he's speaking of him as Lord, is he speaking of him as an earthly guy sitting on a throne? Or is he divinely attributing or angelically attributing that this Christ-like figure is an angel of the Lord? Therefore, he may be saying James is just another fellow brother. Now, I've heard both arguments. I'm still split. But either way, whether that's correct or not, we can't. It's ambiguous enough not to determine and say, as a matter of fact. And then we can go to Josephus. Well, Derek, your point is well argued and proven to be wrong in Josephus. But is that James, the brother of Jesus, the son of, is it Damnius, if I'm not mistaken? Luther, in Josephus's quote on James?
I believe it is, because that could be a different family.
It could be a different...
In Josephus, yeah.
So it's complicated, and at the end of the day, I don't think we have sufficient evidence to say, like Bart Ehrman says, and I'm not saying there wasn't a Jesus, by the way. I'm saying the way he says it, Bart Ehrman says it is a matter of fact, historical fact, that Jesus did exist. Now we got to say, who was he? Oh, well, he was this rabbi teacher who really did get crucified under Pontius Pilate. Well, for what? And so we need to get more on him and find out more about this guy if he really did exist. I know that he may have.
Let me throw two things at you. One was Jesus. There was a story that Jesus actually did lead a revolt against Pontius Pilate when they did the whole thing with the aqueduct, where they raided the temple to build the aqueduct, and that is mentioned in I think it was in Luke, and it's also mentioned in Josephus, and that's when they all got together, and that was right before the crucifixion happened, right before Jesus was taken and crucified.
That's Jesus.
And there's one theory that he was actually the leader of the uprising against Pontius Pilate. And he was arrested and crucified over the aqueduct building. Another thing I want to throw at you is
I've never heard that either.
No. The other thing I want to toss at you is Israel Finkelstein, which is actually his real name and not one that was made up.
How do we know that, Michael?
I don't know, but I tell you what. Because
You're going to have to establish that.
I tell you why. He must have got shoved in lockers and his lunch money taken away from him.
It's an interesting name. Interesting name.
It's like a guy named Poindexter was taking away his lunch money. You know. But anyway, his idea was on David. David was a we hear David in the Bible with this big, huge kingdom. And he says, no, David was this bandit who came around and he defeated a few people and he came in and he settled in Israel and defended Israel. And the actual whole city was only like a few acres that he was his entire empire. And then they kind of build this mystique around him. And that's how you ended up getting all these things about David. So, it's something similar maybe happened to Jesus. They built a mystique around somebody who really did little to nothing.
Well, here's the problem. And I'm not saying that this couldn't be the case in all of this. I'm very open-minded. I just know, I'll put it like this. We all agree that the hocus pocus is not true. Okay. That there, if it's saying something, it might be esoteric, it might be celestial, it might be something allegory. And if they're trying to claim it's literal, personally, I don't buy it. Okay. It's just not going to buy it if that is the case. But I want to say, with Luther talking about these guys, especially if the boss of Pontius Pilate is aware that this guy's trying to uprise against this guy that he works for or works for him, why did he mention this rebel that obviously had to be important enough to try and at least talk about him? And don't you think early church fathers would have maybe mishandled this information and at least quoted and said, oh, by the way, these liars of our Lord, and Savior or whatever, just to prove a point to maybe some of these Gnostics that said he didn't actually physically exist, he was phantom, or possibly trying to bring up this guy back in the first century at that time if he was doing it. Now, I'm not saying I got to look at this theory. I've never heard of it, but I like to speculate and think, both sides of the fence. I just don't think there's sufficient evidence to say, as a matter of fact, the way that Bart Ehrman does with definitive answer, he absolutely existed. He is absolutely a historical man. And one of his arguments is nobody has this much material written on them and did not exist. And goes into the first century, how much material is written about this guy, blah, blah, blah. Could you write?
William Tell didn't exist.
Do what?
William Tell didn't exist.
William Tell, Derek.
Oh, yeah.
And they'll show you the village where William Tell lived. They'll show you the tree where he shot the apple off his kid's head, and they'll sell you a souvenir. But the guy never lived.
Right. This guy Jesus could have lived, Michael. That's the thing. I'm not denying it. He's just not what I'm seeing. And if he is what you're saying, he's this small little smidge somehow in the grand scheme of the story that's mythology. And it's like, oh, by the way, really this guy was fucking around with this guy Pontius Pilate and they had to take him out. How do we know with that? And then you got the whole grand scheme of all these other things he did supposedly, but none of that actually happened. But he was a rebel leader against Pontius Pilate. It's like, where did all this other meat on the bone come from?
Well, Derek, I don't like that trade-off. It's worse for him to be that kind of an insignificant, minuscule character than for him to never have existed. What use is he if he's that insignificant? I mean, it's like saying that's a hollow victory. You want to say, oh, yeah, we know he existed. Suppose you prove that, bottom line. And then you find out he's this nobody. Who wins that? What kind of victory is that for the faith? Nothing.
Jesus is a natural evolution from the Greek Gnosticism, from coming out. He is a product of Alexandria. All the stuff and the wisdom that he has.
Okay, let's talk Alexandria. Sure, and I agree with that.
He's part of this natural evolution that came about. So was there a man who kind of fit the bill that they assigned this natural
Nah,
evolution to? Or
we don't
did they
need him.
make it?
Occam's
They really
razor.
did.
We don't
If
need him.
he didn't exist, they would have made him up.
Right, and that's where I think there's other factors we weigh in, theological factors. I mean, like the 70 years. I got to get Mike Lawrence on the show sometime too. He's talked about a 70-year theory, but I just did a show with James Stevens Valiant, and he talked about the reason. And he's actually more of a historicist than he is mythicist. He actually thinks there may have been an actual rebel guy named Jesus, but they whitewashed and mythologized him so much that he became a pundit for Rome, so to speak. And nonetheless, he makes this point that the Jews couldn't, just like the first temple destruction, hey, how do we explain this? And Jeroboam and them are explaining why. Well, we sinned and it's Israel's fault. The same thing happens in the New Testament. Blame Israel, blame Israel, blame Israel. Temple destruction happens all of a sudden. Jesus keeps warning about it. Well, what the Mike Lawrence and them are saying, and including James Valiant here, that made me think more reason to make this guy up is now they need an explanation for why the temple did get destroyed. Now, one of two things happen. They either look back, Jews who wrote this, and said, look, this guy Jesus, we missed out on him in the 30s. He was the guy. That was him. So now we need to backdate and pretend this historical guy somehow was the Messiah, which is why in 70 AD Rome kicked our butts. And we sinned because we didn't follow this guy back here who claimed to be a Messiah.
Right.
Or we invent a theory of a Uncle Sam that we messed up and didn't follow back here, and somehow have this guy be the reason why 70 AD happened. It just, to me, it's like either way, in the end, it doesn't matter. It's just an interesting idea that makes me think there's too many things that make me think, why'd they go back 70 years? I mean, why are they going back and having a 40-year exact generation like they did with Moses? Why is it so theological that the temple's destruction and you just go back, 40 years and you're right there with Pontius Pilate and these guys and the perfect timing to have this stuff happen? Theologically, it makes too much sense to me rather than historically, and I'm speculating. But
well, Pontius Pilate disappeared from the scene. Nobody knows what happened to him. After he went back to Rome, he was recalled under Lucius Vitellius in 36 or 37 AD. So he's just the guy you need under whose crucifixion Jesus had to happen, Jesus' crucifixion, because nobody knows what happened to Pilate. He's the perfect figure for him to be crucified under. You look in history and say, well, who are we going to pick there? Oh, yeah, this guy. Pin it on him. We can't find him.
Now, someone might think we're conspiracy nuts because they're like, why would they go through all that work to create this guy and to do all that? I think it's hard enough to believe that the story is telling us factual evidence of this historical guy Jesus by just looking at the evidence we do have. It's like, dude, how do you make sense of this? And there's so many theories. So, like, why did the Jews just stone him if he actually was committing blasphemy? I mean, that would have been Torah. That would have been the right time to go ahead and get rid of this guy. Instead, they take him to Pontius Pilate to Herod to Pontius Pilate. And there's so many copies of the Old Testament here. The scapegoat having Jesus, Barabbas, Jesus. There's too much theology. It's like,
you just look at the Last Supper, where he's doing this Dionysus rite, where he's doing the body and blood of Christ. That is pure Greek. That's coming from your Gnostic Greeks. So everything is coming out of Alexandria for him to do this. So that's where the story seemed to have originated. Now let me throw some wrenches in the works here. Josephus writes about 3 other Jesuses who were messiahs in his work. And the book of Revelation, the Jesus mentioned in there is not the Jesus of the Bible. That book of Revelation was written by Messianic Jews, and that is a different Jesus who is coming to conquer Rome. So they had a whole idea of a Messiah being named Jesus also. Jesus being the Greek version of Joshua, who was Pisces in the Old Testament, and this being going into the age of Pisces. We have the two fish that the Christians used as their symbol,
Correct.
which was the symbol of Pisces. And if you go look at the oldest, I won't say church, but prayer place that they had in Megiddo, you can just Google that up, and the Google mosaic Megiddo, and it shows this nice little flora with Pisces right in the middle of it. I mean, it's
Michael, you bring up a good point, and I mean, we can go into how that affects possible who or what, I'll even say, not who, but what Jesus even is. Is it a guy who's going to come under this symbol somehow? Could it be that this is something angelic? And I only say that to say, when I look at it, like I've been saying theologically, I wanted to ask you a question in this. When do you date the story of Joseph from Genesis 38 to 50? When do you think that was written? I mean, you probably don't have a definitive date, but like approximately, do you have an idea? And the reason I want to say that before you answer is I've been noticing theological comparisons between the sacrament or the Eucharist or the, let's just say it, the Lord's Supper, whatever, Last Supper, where Jesus is telling his disciples, break this is my body, drink this is my blood, and do this in remembrance of me, which is Dionysus, okay, or a Dionysian Alexandrian mystery school type of practice. However, I found the same ritual theologically in the story of Joseph when he goes into the dungeon in Egypt. The two men have the dreams. One's a baker, one's a wine bearer. Both of them in 3 days. Well, I had 3 baskets, or I had 3, whatever. The wine bearer has 3 grape clusters, whatever the story tells. In 3 days, he said, you're going to be resurrected and killed to the baker, and you're going to be resurrected and you're going to be granted back its status with Pharaoh, which technically would be God, so to speak, in this. And one of them is resurrected to damnation, just like Jesus talks about in the New Testament. The other is resurrected to eternal life, so to speak, according to the New Testament kind of idea. However, as soon as this wine bearer goes to leave, he says, don't forget me, remember me, just like Jesus tells his disciples, do this in remembrance of me. And now I love this because what you say about this Dionysian, and mystery school concept that comes from other pagan sources that kind of creep in. What about that being here in this story? Do you still think that has a Dionysus idea with the wine and the baker, and in the Joseph story, and then going up to Pharaoh, or is it Egyptian? Is it? What do you think?
I never really thought of it in those terms until you just mentioned it, but I think I had that initially was cut from the initial one and was placed in later. So yeah, that would have been written probably 200 to 300 BC, maybe somewhere in that area. I mean, it was time for them to have all types of influences from both the Egyptians and the Greeks to have made that story. I don't
I've been looking at that kind of stuff, like even Judas. You mentioned Judas Iscariot, and you're like, well, you might have been a rebel leader. Here's why I ask the questions I do, Michael. And you can disagree or even just say, hey, I haven't thought about it that way, and that's good, because I am looking at it with those fresh lenses in a way, right? And I looked at the narrative in Genesis 38, and I saw that the very brother that betrayed Joseph's name was Judah. He was the first guy that betrayed him. Now, all the others were on board, so to speak. One of them wasn't quite, according to the narrative. The first brother who was, the plan was to get rid of Joseph was Judah in the narrative in Genesis 38. The brother who betrayed Jesus, Judas, the Galilean, it's just Hellenized. It's more Hellenized, and so it's not Judah, it's Judas. And it's this copy. All it is to me, and this is why I'm thinking mythicism to some degree, and at least minimal historicism, but I'm on the side of these guys are rewrites, and possibly you need to show me, I need more bone. I need bone. I need something I can knock on better than, well, Judas seems like rebel leaders that were around because he was an Iscariot, and Iscariot is a Sicarii, and Sicarii were people that were there. There may have been. It's just this guy, Judas, fits the narrative perfect to Joseph, and everything else starts to fall in line too. The betrayal for the silver, we know that's a copy from them selling off Joseph and getting their money for selling off Joseph. They take the coat of many colors to their father, all that kind of stuff. There's a rewrite of the story, and I have a hard time buying what's history, what's theology. Of course, that's the way they wrote, so it's hard to find the bone, but that's where I'm at.
So Derek and Michael, but if you take it back to the story of Joseph and his brothers, and you take the names of the 12 patriarchs, and then you look at a list of them as they are written in Greek, those specific names that you find in Revelation with a slight modification, the numerical value of those together is 8880, which is the reflection of the sun. It is taken from the solar deity based upon the Omphalos cube, as the name Jesus is. So how could the numerical value of Jesus be 888? And the numerical value of the additive names of all of the 12 tribes of Israel be 8880? How were those names selected? Were they even real people in order for them to have that result? I mean, it's almost as if, yeah, I'd like to pick you as a patriarch of the tribe, but your name doesn't quite add up, so I have to disqualify you. Does that make any sense? Find somebody with the right numerical value and bring them in. I mean, all of that has to be taken into consideration. So, you know, where does it fit in? So you go back to Joseph, and even that has some mythical characteristics that we can't seem to pin down in history.
Do you guys know if there's other manuscripts with different names, though? That would be another good example of showing, hey, maybe they didn't all have the same names or the same numerical value calculating gematria-wise. So these are ways to be critical of our own views. And I really am trying to be critical of my view. But see, when it's like the underdogs, when Conor McGregor went to go fight in this recent boxing match, he's the underdog. Bottom line is he was going to probably get his ass whooped. 99% chance he wasn't going to win that match. I mean, you're going against Floyd Money Mayweather. This is a guy who was born to dance in the ring and just get you and miss everything you throw at him. However, I rooted for him in light of the fact that he had confidence. He went in like a lion. He said, I don't care. I'm going to take you down. He loses. He wins out, and he loses in the 11th round. Probably could have ended sooner. Floyd was probably thinking money. Floyd was thinking, let's make sure this drags out because the millions I'm putting into this and getting out of this, I got to make this thing look like it's worth a show. I say that to say historicism is the winner right now in terms of the majority. Everyone assumes this guy exists. I see these mythicists come in with their arguments. They're not understood. They're ridiculed and mocked. You're just a total fringe, absolute conspiracy theorist. You aren't really looking at the sources. You're not really checking this stuff out. And at the end of the day, I listen to Dr. Bob a lot on this stuff, and I think this is important. Dr. Bob says there could have been, Derek. That doesn't sound like a nutcase to me, or a conspiracy theorist. A conspiracy theorist tells me the earth is flat. You can't get near the 200-foot ice wall. The government keeps you from being able to send up something to see that, so you can't tell that the earth is flat. I mean, like, that to me is like, no matter what, it has to be this way. Dr. Bob says there could have been a Jesus, but if there was, what do we really know about him for sure? And how can we know anything about him? That to me is a very skeptical and a reasonable approach. And as I started to approach it, I thought to myself, the best damn evidence I could think of if there was a guy named Jesus is that he was exactly what you said, Mike. He was a rebel leader. He could have revolted against Pontius Pilate. He could have revolted against Rome in some way, but the guy would have been crucified, in my opinion, and from what I've been hearing other scholars say, the ones that are skeptical, not the Jesus believers, that this guy wouldn't have been crucified unless he was a problem for Rome. Now, one could say the purse of the Jews came out and said, hey, you guys handle this guy. That's possible too, but we don't have any evidence. It's speculation. I am just saying it's important that if we weigh the theology of it and we see the rewrite of the Old Testament, we see the parallels and we see this stuff, at what point have we chewed away the meat and said, all right, here's the bone. This guy was this. Bart Ehrman says he was a rabbi. That's the bone. Bart Ehrman says if there's anything we can know about Jesus, he was absolutely crucified. That we can know, he said. Why? Because Paul says Jesus was crucified and he resurrected. And if the resurrection's not true, our whole faith is falling apart. How do we know Paul's crucifixion, resurrection concepts aren't celestial? How do we know he's not a mystery school Gnostic type guy who's saying celestial, some solstice idea that Jesus being the sun dies, rises again? How come he had to be a Jewish guy? And I'm just asking the question. I'm not saying that's the case.
How is it that all of Paul's epistles are not forgeries? We don't even know if, I mean, there's only like a handful of the epistles that he wrote that are considered to be actual Pauline, and the rest are considered to be forgeries. So you have to figure out, you know, you just have to look at the ones that actually Paul actually wrote, if there was a Paul, and not some.
Yeah, and if there were original epistles, because the term forgery necessitates there being a real somewhere, which
Right.
we don't know.
You can't definitively know that. And me and you were talking about that the other day, Luther, and that's what was interesting. I even mentioned that to Dr. Bob. We got to do a show on that and get him to explain. I love that. What if Paul's a surname? I mean, what if Jesus is a title? What if it's not an actual guy, so to speak, but a title? I'm not saying there aren't Jesuses that were people. Josephus talks about them. But why is it that Matthew the way that Matthew describes this guy that, you know, is Jesus, the guy, the person, is that he was going to be born of a virgin, or at least not in this case be born of a virgin in Matthew, but nonetheless he's going to be born, right? And the angel says, you shall call his name Jesus, and that's it? No. For he shall save his people from their sins. The reason his name is Jesus is that he's going to save his people from their sins. That sounds very, very theological. That sounds to me, you're saying
it is the Bible, you know.
I know, I'm just pointing it out, like, and I have to emphasize that, man, because if he's just a guy, like all the scholars keep throwing around this, Jesus, why is he titled the very thing he's supposed to do? In essence, it's like the angels giving us another, like an Old Testament story myth. You know, he's going to be the savior of his people. This is why we're naming him Jesus. Someone could say, well, I mean, there were many Jesuses, and they just picked that guy because his name was Jesus, and then they threw this story.
Yeah, it was a common name. It's a very common name.
Mm-hmm.
It sure was. 3 out of 8 high priests from the beginning of the millennium to well, actually before the beginning of the millennium, I forget what the starting point is, but going to 70 AD, 3 of 8 of them were named Jesus. What does that say to you? It says to you that whoever Jesus was, he was meant to be a common man, a sort of everyman, because, I mean, you didn't name him Aristophanes. I mean, you named him Jesus. Very, you know, what does that say? Name him John.
I actually would love to get a historicist, though, that it has patience with someone who's skeptical like me, and I say that because, like, you're into the celestial stuff, Mike, but I think this is a fascinating question. MythVision's wrapped around, and
well, Matthew is the most astrological gospel of the 4, so it's almost like it was taken from the Greek version of the constellations. And when you mentioned Joseph, the same star Arcturus which was the coat of many colors. It's actually a garnet star, and that was the robe that Jesus wore when he was being mocked. All right, so there's a correlation between the two. Judah, the story of Judah is the northern crown, right? Judah and Tamar was the northern crown, and that was the crown of thorns that Jesus wore. So there was astrologically, that's where the two are connected.
I love this stuff, man.
Awesome, awesome, awesome. Okay, at the end of Mark, this Simon of Cyrene, who supposedly bore the cross, according to some lores, he was crucified instead of Jesus, but that's not where I'm going. He had two sons.
That's a Muslim story, yeah.
Exactly. But he had two sons. One was named Alexander, and the other was named Rufus. Interesting. In the time of Claudius, exactly at the time that the Jesus story was coming into popularity, there was Cluvius Rufus, who worked in the administration of Claudius, and you had Tiberius Alexander, who was procurator of Judea from 44 to 46. And they are the sons of this guy from Cyrene. Now, this is all in the Gospel of Mark. Why Simon of Cyrene? Well, I don't know who Simon was, but Jason of Cyrene was quite an important title at the time, because Second Maccabees, which was the manual on Jewish rebellion, was written by Jason of Cyrene. So you invent a character called Simon of Cyrene to say, well, this is the anti-rebel manual. Mark is going to be the anti-rebel. We know that instead of Jason of Cyrene, we got to have an opposite kind of character responsible for Mark. We're put him in there. I mean, it's just so much that's yet unaccounted for. I can't explain it. But I'm going to keep trying.
You want to just make the folks of Cyrene look good, being helpful people. Come live in our city of Cyrene, Lovely people here. We'll help you. We'll carry your cross for you.
Wow.
Good gracious.
That's
Good
interesting,
gracious.
though. And that only appears in Mark?
Yeah, that detail is only in Mark.
Interesting.
Hey, guys, as the hour draws later and later, man, I have never been party to a show like this where we had so much free flowing, and it was kind of like a tripod. We were like bouncing off each other here. And you got us started, Michael, and took us really through almost the history of Judaism throughout all the conquests, which was wonderful. When is your book scheduled to be published? When is this going to be ready?
I haven't started writing it, and I think I'm going to start with the outline probably the beginning of the year. When I just discovered, I had the writer's block. I didn't know how to figure out how this Old Testament worked when it was written, because I knew it was written later than what I had. But now that I discovered Nebuchadnezzar, it's like, okay, that fits in. That was the missing piece. So now that I have the missing piece of the puzzle, I can start putting it together. So I need to start getting an outline going, a detailed outline. And the outline is going to be similar to what we just talked about tonight. So if you watch tonight's show, you probably don't have to get the book.
No, still get the book. There's always detail.
Except I'm going to include all the good, juicy meat, astrological parts from this book in there, just for filler.
Yeah, I very much doubt. Oh, go ahead, listen.
No. I want that book, but unfortunately, I got the Kindle version, and it doesn't do it justice, Mike. I have the other book by you, but I got to get that one, On Earth as It Is in Heaven.
Well,
hard copy.
When we get closer to that time, as you're writing your book, I'd like to have another show where we really delve into some of the fresh ideas that you're currently writing as you go. This way we can keep our...
I'll end up changing stuff as I start writing. As I write, I also research, and it's like, oh, okay.
Pull the scab off. It's okay. It'll heal.
Yeah.
Oh,
Ouch. Michael, how can our viewers contact you, find out more about you, contribute to your research, help support you, whatever? How can they do that?
Well, I do a lot on eBay, so I'm generally at the Windsor Post Office around 11 o'clock in the morning. But other than that, if you don't want to make the trip, hey, you know, we got the, you can just, we can talk right under the chat right here on YouTube if you want, because I go back and I'm an egomaniac. I'm a real narcissist, and you know, I look and see if anybody wrote anything, and I also have my email address. We put in the first one, which is MikeLedo@AOL.com, and I apologize for having an AOL email address, but in 1998, when I went to get, you had to have an ISP, and AOL was the only one that was toll free where I lived, out here in the boonies. So I had AOL or nothing. And
Say it again, Mike. What's that email?
Mike Ledo, MikeLedo,
Mike
at AOL.com. Or you can do, well, no, I say I got another one, but I never look at it. So, but, yeah, No God, No Masters is my other one.
We were lucky, Derek, because we just messaged you, Mike, on Facebook, and then I was hoping. I said, "Is that the Michael Ledo that wrote The Secret Astrology of the Bible?" And hey, you know, it led to this night. I mean, you know, and now we've done 2 shows with you, 2.5 shows, whatever. So what more could we ask for, right? I tell you what, this one thing I ask for before we go. Whatever you do, please don't grind an axe like so many others who have done books with astrotheology and celestial mythology. You know, you get to page 308 and all of a sudden, you know, you get mad at the Catholic Church because they didn't tell you the truth and that ridiculous stuff. It doesn't have any place in real scholarship. So I like the fact that you're
I'm going to have to mention that Marduk is not from the 12th planet. You know, that's about it.
We'll let you do that, but keep it calm,
Okay.
man. Keep it, you know, just dispassionate, you know, as they say, just the facts, ma'am. But I mean, you know, I love your balanced treatment. So by all means, we hope that you stick with that. So, man, it was great having you once again, everybody. Mike Ledo, the man. Found out about him through Santos Bonacci, and hey, he writes his own ticket. I mean, he is a very fine researcher in his own right. Derek, you want to add anything before we sign off tonight?
I just want to close on one thing. Thank you, Mike, for joining us on the show. And one thing I really like about what you do in your research, and it's unique, I don't see it often, not saying it's not there, is that you actually change with the evidence that you do find. You don't put yourself in a situation where you force that to be the case. You are very probabilistic, and you go based off probability, and you say, hey, here's the possibility, this what seems to be. And I really, really like that, because that's, to me, the best kind of scholar you can get. When you have scholars who just have it all and they know it, what else can they learn? They have the answers. And if new evidence arises, they have their preconceived ideas. There is no place to learn. You're a true scholar and a true student, and I appreciate you joining us.
Thank you. I constantly question everything I write. I look for evidence, either support it or deny it, and go where it's at. So, and I try not to make up things or tap dance around facts that get in the way of my theory. Let me give you an example. One of the theories I was holding was that all astrology came out of this Gobekli Tepe Caucasus region, and when the Indo-European language expanded, the astrology went with it. And then this is why we have this similar astrology from India to the Celtics, and that fell apart. It just, there was nothing there to support that. So it's like, okay, it's back to aliens, you know.
Yeah.
You know, it's like I got nothing on
Awesome,
that.
man. Awesome.
That's awesome.
So
Way to go, Mike. Way to go. Way to go. Once again, we can't wait to have you again, right, Derek?
That's right. That is right.
Take us out, Derek.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, if you heard, he already has 2 books. Be sure to go on Amazon and search them. I'll make sure they're down in the description of the video so you guys can get a copy of it. If you want to learn more about some of the underlying, I like to call this the bones, not the history. To me, the bones are the celestial myth. When you really want to understand how these religions formulated and what kept them together, and also why they're so common and look similar to other myths, it's going to come into his type of work. It's going to come into the celestial myths, what pieces all these religions together. Be sure to get the books. Michael has done excellent work. He has new research he's constantly coming out with, and show him some love. MikeLedo@AOL.com. We love you here at MythVision. You saw the resurrected Luther firsthand. He put his hand on you. You put your hand on his side. You felt the holes. You know he's real. So blessed is he who does not see from here on out, and yet still believe. You know.
Yeah. Thanks,
Luther,
guys.
I want to ask you on public here. When's that book gonna be ready?
That's going to be spring of next year, Derek. So it's not going to be as long as it has been. And I can hardly wait. We got everything lined up, and it looks like I've hit a sweet spot in doing the home stretch here. So it won't be long. Now, when I say spring of next year, that's the manuscript being ready. Actual publication and release might be a little bit after that. But it won't be long. Certainly be sometime summer of next year.
Well, thank you so much for joining me again here at MythVision Podcast. We love you guys. Peace.